Bom, vamos começando por aqui, então. Boa tarde a todos e todas. Meu nome é Caroline Prolo, eu sou advogada, sou sócia da área ambiental e de mudanças climáticas do Stock Forbes Advogados e sou fundadora da La Clima, uma rede de advogados de mudanças climáticas na América Latina. Eu sou a apresentadora e moderadora dessa série de webinars mensais sobre mercados de carbono, que está sendo organizada pelo Laboratório de Inovação Financeira, o LAB, que é uma iniciativa coordenada pela CVM, ABDE, BID e GIZ, aqui no Brasil. E esse evento também está sendo feito em colaboração regional com o BID e o GIZ. Essa série tem como objetivo promover a disseminação de conhecimento sobre esse tema de mercados de carbono para facilitar o desenvolvimento dessa discussão no Brasil e na América Latina. Como vocês viram, a gente está no segundo episódio da série. No primeiro, nós tratamos de um panorama geral sobre o assunto mercado de carbono, fizemos um giro sobre os mercados internacionais, os mercados domésticos e também os mercados voluntários. E agora a gente está se encaminhando para, no segundo webinar da série, falar sobre mercados domésticos de carbono, mais especificamente. Eu vou explicar aqui como vai funcionar o nosso evento e dar algumas orientações iniciais para vocês. Nesse caso, diferente do primeiro webinar, nós vamos ter um grande painel. Nós temos 6 painelistas hoje, então é um grande número de especialistas para trazer essas discussões para a gente. Mas antes a gente vai começar com uma abertura aí das nossas organizadoras de parte do BID e do GIZ. Aí depois eu vou fazer uma breve recapitulação do que nós vimos no primeiro webinar e que tem relação com o tema deste encontro de hoje. Aí o nosso painel vai se formar, vamos ouvir dos nossos 6 painelistas e no final vamos ter uma sessão de Q&A. Bem, o evento, assim como da primeira vez, também vai ser feito com as perguntas especificamente por meio daquela ferramenta de Q&A, que vocês podem ver aí na parte de baixo da tela, mas é claro que comentários no chat são muito bem-vindos. Nós temos também, como vocês podem ver, a ferramenta de tradução do português para o inglês, também está na parte inferior aí da tela, no canto direito, basta que vocês indiquem ali a língua em que preferem ouvir a tradução. Eu vou falar em português e em inglês em alguns momentos aí, porque nós temos também a maior parte dos nossos painelistas vai falar na língua inglesa. Bem, acho que já estamos prontos, então, para começar nosso webinar. E com isso eu começo apresentando mais uma vez a Maria Neto, para fazer suas considerações iniciais. Maria Neto, que tem mestrado em Economia no Instituto de Estudos Internacionais de Genebra, atua há mais de 12 anos no Banco Interamericano de Desenvolvimento como especialista principal em mercados de capitais e instituições financeiras. No Brasil, é a responsável por liderar o Laboratório de Inovação Financeira, que é o maior espaço de colaboração no Brasil de especialistas do sistema financeiro para promover finanças sustentáveis. E antes disso, a Maria Neto também trabalhou no Programa das Nações Unidas para o Desenvolvimento e na Secretaria da Convenção de Mudanças Climáticas da ONU, na UNFCCC, onde foi responsável por liderar o trabalho da instituição na cooperação financeira bilateral e multilateral e acompanhar os fluxos financeiros para enfrentar as mudanças climáticas e o desenvolvimento dos mercados de carbono. Maria, seja muito bem-vinda.
Obrigada, Caroline. É um prazer para nós estarmos aqui representando o Banco Interamericano de Desenvolvimento, mas também todos os sócios do Laboratório de Inovação Financeira no Brasil, que essa é mais uma iniciativa do laboratório, mas também para nós uma iniciativa importante, também regional. I will turn to English because I know that most of the event is going to be English, so I will be talking English, and then I understand we have here the interpretation for those who want to listen to the interpretation at the same time. For us from Inter-American Development Bank, the conversation that we have today is a very important one. It's an important one for Brazil, but it's an important one for the region in general. From the first conversation we had in the first webinar, we see that the market, the carbon market, is coming back, basically, is developing very quickly, but that there are also a lot of uncertainties and questions on how this market will shape up. And one of the questions that we want to deal here with the lab and with these events is, how can we share experiences more than just, knowledge, to think about how can we help both in Brazil through the lab, but also in the region, governments and the private sector to better position itself to benefit, but also promote the market in the right direction. No? In this sense, I think we have very interesting examples today from the region and outside the region on how some of the governments at national level or regional level have been addressing somehow the regulation and testing, giving some more certainty on how the market should operate. I think there are a lot of lessons that we'll learn, particularly from this session, on what things have worked and not worked so well, and how can we work together with governments and regulators and private sector to provide more certainty to the market, not only from the side of methodologies, but also in terms of signals of carbon pricing and the type of sectors and opportunity we can promote in the region. So for us, Inter-American Development Bank, this is really an exciting event today because it's an opportunity for us to have a conversation about what has worked and not worked so well, but how can we actually work also with these lessons learned to replicate it more broadly in the region and expand the experiences that we'll see here, for example, in Colombia and Mexico have been moving on. For us, the national experiences are very important as well as the international ones. The series of webinars will be looking at different perspectives. I understand we'll have in the next sessions also the voluntary markets. We'll be looking at also some questions relating more of the uncertainties that are in general there, both from voluntary as well as this kind of, some national regulated markets. But I think we need to learn from this session in particular, and for the lab now, coming to the lab, how can we help a dialogue on providing more certainty and more clarity that would allow the market to develop. This year is an important year in terms of preparation. We are very hopeful from the side of Inter-American Development Bank. We also talked about this the last time, that the Article 6 of the Paris agreements could, and finally in Glasgow, come up to some kind of more detailed regulation so that it can become applicable. And a lot of those exercises that are being already undertaken, particularly I would say now from what we call the non-Annex 1 countries, the developing industrial countries like the case of Mexico or Colombia, is going to be very important to see also how we can help, in the case of Brazil, the Brazilian context, to get prepared to and take advantage of the Glasgow decisions. And again, for IDB, the same commitment at the regional level as we see this as a challenge and an opportunity for the whole region. Without more delay, Caroline, because I think the most important is now to listen to the experiences of everybody here, I pass on to you back.
Thank you very much, Maria. So I'll be calling now Itzel Alcereca. She is Senior Coordinator in Mexico for the Global Felicity Program, an initiative implemented by the GIZ on behalf of the German Ministry for the Environment and the European Investment Bank to support cities on capacity building to structure bankable projects and access climate finance. And since March, she is the co-spokesperson for the regional network of GIZ for environmental management and rural development in Latin America and the Caribbean. And Itzel also holds a degree in chemistry and a master's in engineering and project management. She has experience in planning and implementation of projects related to climate change and sustainable development in local governments in Latin America, as well as financing mechanisms for sustainable infrastructure in close collaboration with the federal government and international cooperation agencies. Thank you, Itzel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Maria, as well. Prezados, bem-vindos a este segundo webinario. Unfortunately, that's all my Portuguese, or Portuñol, so I will switch on English as well. So, warm regards from a very sunny Mexico City. I thank these few minutes to address to you and meet you all. I come today as one spokesperson of GIZ Regional Network, GADERALC, that it's the community for environment management and rural development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Yes, this community, for those that doesn't know this one, it gathers several GIZ projects and programs in the region to approach topics related to environment, forestry, energy, water, and recently on climate finance as well. So GIZ Sectoral Network is keen to liaison with key partners in the region like IDB and LAB. So in this sense, we're really glad that our paths cross over during 2020 with our working group related to seek regional solutions on climate finance. And in the middle of a world COVID crisis, we drafted this opportunity for collaborate specifically on carbon markets. So this collaboration has bloomed somehow into the webinar series as a start of a beautiful friendship, quoting this last catchy phrase of the movie Casablanca. Well, and regarding this beautiful friendship, starts with domestic carbon markets. So just to put you in context, Germany has over 10 years of experience with emissions trading and emissions reports. Therefore, in the region, the collaboration's objective is to benefit from German and European lessons learned, as Maria was mentioning, to learn from best practices, but also to avoid or bypass some mistakes that have been made in Europe before. Regarding the emission trading system, ETS, in Latin America, Maria was mentioning, well, some cases in Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and I want to focus one example where GIZ has been supporting through the project SISEM in Mexico. Well, of course, later on, our colleague from Mexican Stock Exchange Market, he will talk a little bit further, but it's important that this SISEM has been implemented since the year 2017, and the main counterpart is the Mexican Ministry of Environment, Semarnat. I don't want to super deep dive into this because later on you will hear it from the panelists themselves. Just want to give you a quick commercial and let you know that the implementation of the ETS test program started in January 2020 and will last for 3 years. Mexico is one of the first countries in Latin America to implement an ETS, but also the energy and industry sectors are regulated. Approximately 40% of the country's GHG emissions are covered. And the SISEM project of GIZ Mexico supports the Ministry of Environment, Semarnat, in the design and implementation of this instrument. And finally, in the chat box later on, I will put some links where you can find even more information on GADERALC, the key findings of the work stream on climate finance, and the website of the Semarnat's ETS test program, where we want to share with you a very nice and comprehensive brochure on English that you can review for more detailed information. Thanks, muito obrigada.
Thank you, Itzel. Bem, em português agora, vou só lembrar um pouco como começou essa conversa no nosso webinar anterior e contextualizar para o assunto de hoje. Né? Então, acho que vocês devem se lembrar que a Stephanie, da ICAP, no último webinar, trouxe alguns conceitos importantes sobre os mercados de carbono domésticos. A gente está falando aqui de mercados de carbono regulados por governos regionais, nacionais ou subnacionais, né? Esses mercados, eles estão estruturados aí pelos governos no que a gente chama de sistemas de comércio de emissão. E nesse sistema, acho que tem algumas características importantes. Vou falar de 3. A primeira delas, esses sistemas são criados com o governo estabelecendo um limite máximo de emissões de CO2 equivalente para um determinado setor da economia, ou mais de um setor da economia. Então, primeiro ponto. Segundo, em criando esse limite máximo, o governo cria cotas que representam, cada uma tonelada de carbono equivalente desse cap total de limite de emissões que esse setor pode gerar, né? E aí o terceiro ponto é que o governo determina que esses agentes regulados desses setores somente podem emitir CO2 equivalente, né, gases de efeito estufa, se tiverem essas cotas ou permissões para justificar cada tonelada de carbono equivalente emitida. Então, essa é a lógica, né? E aí, assim, a cada ano, o agente regulado, ele precisa prestar contas dessas suas emissões para o governo, apresentando as permissões equivalentes à quantidade de emissões que foi gerada, né? E aí, essas cotas são distribuídas para os agentes regulados, podem ser tanto de forma gratuita, quanto pode ser feito por meio de leilões. Isso é algo que acho que a gente vai avaliar aqui nos próximos, com os painelistas, em cada modelo de mercado jurisdicional, como isso se manifesta, porque normalmente, na fase piloto de implementação desses mercados, mais no início, é comum que essas cotas sejam distribuídas gratuitamente pelo governo para os agentes regulados, e com o passar do tempo, essa distribuição gratuita vai sendo limitada e uma parte vai sendo leiloada, né? E aí existem também vários critérios para se determinar qual é a alocação dessas permissões para os agentes regulados, se vai levar em consideração os níveis históricos de emissão que aquele determinado operador emitiu ao longo do tempo, ou se vai usar um benchmark da indústria de um caso de uma companhia que tenha um exemplo de eficiência na gestão das suas emissões. Outra característica importante é que alguns desses sistemas de comércio de emissões também permitem que os agentes regulados possam usar um certo percentual de offsets para cumprir as suas obrigações, ou para justificar as suas emissões de CO2. Ou seja, eles podem usar créditos de carbono gerados por projetos de carbono de outros mecanismos externos a esse sistema de comércio de emissões, né? E isso também a gente acho que vai ver nos próximos mercados especificamente. E acho que aí, por fim, também para não ocupar muito o espaço do que os nossos palestrantes vão falar, uma característica também a se considerar é, nesse contexto atual, como esses mercados conversam com os mercados do artigo 6 do Acordo de Paris, né, nessa perspectiva de haver um mercado mais global, com transferências internacionais entre os países. Então, existe aí um potencial de esses mercados domésticos se linkarem uns com os outros, também nesse contexto agora mais global. Então, para discutir melhor esses e outros muitos aspectos dos mercados domésticos, nós vamos conversar aqui com reguladores e especialistas nos mercados da União Europeia, da Califórnia, do México, da Colômbia e da China, e também daquilo que é uma proposta de um sistema de comércio de emissões no Brasil, que não existe ainda exatamente um mercado. Espero que vocês gostem e vou, sem mais delongas, chamar, então, o nosso painel. E agora vou mudar para o inglês. Mas não sem antes dizer que a lógica, vocês vão perceber, é a gente contar uma história da implementação de mercados de carbono domésticos. A gente vai começar dos mais antigos para os mais novos, para poder também acompanhar essa evolução. So, shifting to English now, I'm calling here Vicky Pollard. Vicky has been working on environmental policy and economics since 1993. She joined the European Commission in 2004 and worked on the EU's Lisbon Strategy for Growth and Jobs and the review of the EU Sustainable Development Strategy before joining the climate change team. She has worked on climate change for the Commission since 2006, covering international negotiations and also relations with the US and other OECD countries and domestic policy, including the implementation of the EU emissions trading system. In August 2014, Vicky took up the post of First Counselor on Environment and Climate in the EU's delegation to China, based in Beijing, covering all aspects of the relationship with China on the environment and climate change. Vicky returned to Brussels in September 2019, where she is now a team leader for international carbon markets in the European Commission's DG Climate Action. So, Vicky, thank you very much, and you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Caroline, Maria, and Itzel, and thank you very much to Lab, to IDB and GIZ for this opportunity to speak. I'll just share my screen with you. I have a few slides, and I hope you can see those. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Good. As I think you, I have to be able to change screen. Better. The EU emissions trading system has been in place since the 1st of January 2005. And as Caroline explained, it's a mandatory cap and trade system. That is, we have 11,000, more than 11,000 installations and aviation operators covered by one single cap. So we have a limit on the total emissions that can be emitted by those polluters. And then those installations receive allowances either for free or buy them on auctions or on the market. And they can determine themselves how many allowances they need for their own purposes to comply with the legislation, and whether they trade those allowances or not. And it's the trading of the allowances on the market which determines the carbon price under the EU ETS. This is a very important factor of an ETS because it ensures that we have a carbon price signal across the EU economy. And that carbon price signal is determined by demand and supply in the market and not set by government. It's been important for us as decision makers because we know what it really costs to meet the targets in the EU ETS. But I think it's also very important for the stability of the system, and very much so, a very important signal as we go towards climate neutrality, showing the need for action and helping those who want to invest in low carbon solutions. So coming back to why we do cap and trade and why we have a mandatory cap and trade system, there are two big advantages. The first is that it gives us certainty in terms of emissions reductions. So we know that for those sectors covered, we know that their emissions will not go over a certain amount year by year. And that's tremendously important. that trajectory is also very important for the operators to know what is happening in terms of the carbon budget available overall. But the second reason for doing it is that, like all regions of the world, we're concerned about competitiveness, about the health of our economy, about the jobs being created. And an ETS creates a lot of flexibility for business. So it's an efficient system whereby companies can decide of themselves when to reduce their emissions, how to reduce their emissions, and whether they need to buy allowances and surrender them, or they'd rather make their own emissions reductions. And what we have now is a very large and liquid market in the European Union with very healthy trading. So we know that we get a good price discovery. The way the system works, as Caroline also explained, is that every year the installations have to monitor and report verified emissions data. They do that on by the 1st of April each year, and then they have to surrender a number of allowances to cover each ton of emissions for that previous year by the 1st of May. So now in the European Union, we're between the period where we have received the emissions data and before we receive the allowances to cover those emissions. What I can give you is for now is the data for 2019. And what we see is very big emissions reductions under the EU ETS. In 2019, we had a 30% reduction compared to 2005 levels, which effectively meant we've over-exceeded the 2020 target already 2 years ago. The data has been released from our registry on the 6th of April. You could find the data in Excel spreadsheet on our website, which shows that for 2020, there's a reduction of above 10%. But I can't go into the details right now because we need to do more analysis and we wait until late reporters come in with their data. What's also important to note is that we have developed the system over time. The system is now at the beginning of phase 4. So we've had already 3 phases corresponding to different climate policy targets. And while phase 4 is set up to meet the EU's NDC as it stood immediately after Paris for 2030, so with a target of minus 40% by 2030, in Europe, with the European Green Deal, we have a big increase in ambition. So we're moving to climate neutrality by 2050. We have a climate target plan, which has set a new target for 2030, which is a 55% reduction relative to 1990 levels. And we're now in the process of revising all the legislation for 2030 to reach that target. And that includes a full review of the ETS legislation. So we will be looking at the level of ambition, but we're also looking at what is included. So far, the emissions trading system has mainly covered big industrial and power sources plus aviation. So we're talking CO2, N2O, PFC, basically industrial gases and gases from burning fossil fuels. We've been focusing on big emitters.
Nós temos focado em questões maiores.
What we're now looking at in terms of the review of the legislation is whether we
se nós vamos
emissions from the maritime sector, but also whether it will be extended to cover emissions from buildings and road transport. So therefore, whether it would cover a large part of the fossil fuel emissions not currently covered under the EU ETS. And those proposals will be made in June 2021. So there's a lot of work going on right now in the Commission on those. In terms of the price signal, what I can say also that you've probably seen a number of different press stories over time about the price of EU allowances. They varied over time. At the beginning, we had some initial issues with oversupply in the market. We had oversupply also following the 2008 financial and economic crisis, also linked to offset use, which I'll come back to. But we now have a market stability reserve and this large increase in ambition. And in the recent weeks, we've been the allowances have been trading at around 40 euros per ton. And that's been, we've been in since 2018, we've had much higher price levels, and I think it's a very strong price signal. What I wanted to show you also in terms of the cap on emissions, the way that the system works in the European Union is that we have, since 2013, a long-term trajectory. So we've set what we call a linear reduction factor, LRF, which sets a percentage by which the total number of allowances, the total emissions possible, reduces year on year. So we are now in phase 4 with reductions of 2.2% each year. But of course, that is likely to change in the review. It's one of the questions up for revision. What this means is that this goes on until we get to net zero, basically. So this sends a very strong message to everybody that the amount that can be emitted goes down, down, and down until we get to zero. What you can see here also are the different phases. And I think in terms of emissions allowances, in terms of allocation, because Caroline mentioned that, in the EU ETS, like many other systems, we started with 100% or close to 100% free allocation. What we started with was free allocation based on historic emissions. But what we've moved to since 2012 has been a benchmarking approach, but also a very big reduction in how much is allocated for free. So since 2012, 100% of allowances for the power sector are auctioned. So the power sector gets basically nothing for free unless there's a couple of special cases where there is a modernization, but it's very small. And that is because the power sector can pass on the costs of the ETS to customers. And to avoid windfall profits, that's the approach we've taken. For industrial sectors, the focus is very much on free allocation for those sectors at risk of carbon leakage. In other words, sectors where if the full cost of the ETS was to be passed on to customers, there may be a relocation of some of the operations to jurisdictions where there is less regulation, which would lead to just a shift of the greenhouse gas emissions rather than a reduction. And that's not our objective. We're very clear, we want to avoid carbon leakage and to make sure that we're reducing emissions, not just shifting them to other parts of the world. Also very important to note is that when we started before the Kyoto Protocol came into force, but for phase 2 and phase 3, we had a large but limited amount of offsets, international offsets from the CDM and joint implementation. So largely CDM credits, CERs, were used for compliance instead of ETS allowances. The aim there was both, on one hand, to reduce the costs within the system, but also to provide a market for these offsets to generate activity and sustainable development elsewhere. It was an important phase, but what happened is that we found that there were a large amount of credits coming from some very cheap sources, industrial projects, so at very low prices, not all, but a lot. and that there was a flood of those credits into the market, especially towards the end of phase 2, because we limited the use of those credits for phase 3 to credits which from new projects from LDCs only, because we wanted to make sure that there was a better distribution of projects between developing countries. And that large flood of offsets was one of the factors which contributed to an oversupply in our system, which led to very low carbon prices in the system. And that's led us to take measures such as the Market Stability Reserve to address prices. And it's very important because for us, fundamentally, the first purpose of having an ETS is to get transformation, emissions reductions and transformation in the EU economy. And if that is put at risk, then the ETS is failing. And so what we now have with phase 4, so as we go into our NDC period, so from 2020 onwards, is that our commitment in the European Union is purely domestic, which means the minus 55% emissions reduction will be achieved entirely within the European Union, with no use of international offsets, which means that we would not be using trading under Article 6 to provide offsets in the EU ETS. However, Article 6 is important to us because we do have provisions for linking the ETS with other cap and trade systems, other mandatory systems. And under those linkages, we have a link with Switzerland. We are also linked with Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. We're open to linking with others. And under those arrangements, we would be doing accounting under Article 6. So that's where it comes in. And just very quickly, so I know we're running out of time, I can see Caroline getting stressed, but just very important to say also that over time, what has happened is that what started just as a cap and trade system focusing on emissions reductions has, there's been an increasing recognition of the importance of the revenues being generated. So of course, as we moved from free allocation to auctioning, some very important revenues are being generated for our member states. And we also created a number of dedicated funds, innovation fund, modernization fund, selling allowances from the total pot. And I think this is very important. You know, the emissions trading system is about transforming our economy. It allows those who have good performance to generate money from selling allowances and having good performance, but it's also very important to support those who have will have a harder time in the transition and will bear higher costs in terms of to make that transition more smoothly and to allow everybody to move towards net zero. And that's why this is also very important for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vicky. I'm calling now Jason Gray. Jason is chief of the Climate Change Program Evaluation Branch, which oversees and implements the Cap and Trade Program at the California Air Resources Board, the CARB. He previously served as manager of the market monitoring section of the Cap and Trade Program and as a staff attorney with CARB. His current duties also include supervising linkage efforts with Quebec. Jason represents the board in various bilateral and multilateral climate partnership initiatives, including with the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, which includes all of the states of the Brazilian Amazon. Before entering the legal profession, Jason worked on environmental education, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable development projects with the US Peace Corps and the WWF in the Central African country of Gabon. He received a bachelor's degree in biology and French from Gonzaga University and a Juris Doctor and certificate in environmental and natural resources law from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. Jason, welcome, and you have the floor now.
Excellent. Can everyone see my screen there? Perfect. Thank you, Caroline, and the lab, and IDV and GIZ for inviting me to be part of the panel today. This is honestly one of my favorite parts of the job I get to do, is to join discussions like this and hear from giants in the field like Vicky, and folks will hear from Colombia and Mexico, and from ICAP, which we are an active member and I think the co-chair this year. So thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be here. As you said, I'm Jason Gray. I oversee the Cap and Trade program for the state of California. The California Air Resources Board is the state agency that is charged with mitigating climate change to our statutory targets, as well as a long history of working on statewide air pollution matters. All right. So I find it helpful to start with a little bit higher level context here, just to look at the progress that we've made so far, but also look at the challenges we have ahead. In California, similar to the EU, similar to really any government, we have legal statutes or legal mandates for what targets we need to hit. And in 2006, our legislature set our initial 2020 target to return to the 1990 levels of emissions in California by 2020. And that's 431 million metric tons in 2020. We actually met this target early, thanks in part to many of our different climate programs, including Cap and Trade. And you can see on the right-hand slide, this shows our 2017 data, where we were below the 2020 target. It also shows the major emitting sources in California, and those are really what's covered by our Cap and Trade program. In 2016, our legislature added a new target of a 40% reduction by 2030. In our most recent climate action plan, which we call our climate change scoping plan, that I'll refer to several times during the presentation, look to lay out a cost-effective and technologically feasible path to achieve the 2030 target. These targets are very important, but they're really milestones. Like all of us are talking about deep decarbonization and carbon neutrality later in mid-century. And our governor has issued an executive order to achieve an 80% reduction by 2050, as well as achieving carbon neutrality by 2045. It's important, I think, for our context to understand that we've chosen this broad portfolio approach to addressing climate change in California. We don't rely on any one program, but instead a series of policies, and some of these policies actually overlap. The Cap and Trade program is an important one of the policies, and it really helps complement those other measures. So if you're reducing your emissions because of our renewable portfolio standard, that's a lower obligation in Cap and Trade. So all of our climate context sits with this portfolio approach, but because of the topic today, I will now focus the rest of my conversation on our Cap and Trade program. And many of our elements are similar to what has occurred in the EU ETS and other ETSs, so I think that's a great kind of lesson to build on what's existing, and I know that's the main purpose of the conversation today. Our program was really important for us to go through a public regulatory process, not only because we have to by law, but because that ensures that we have the broadest range of experience and expertise and information possible. So we've done a lot of workshops, years of workshops, draft regulations, expert working groups, discussions with the EU ETS and others to learn from those experiences in our own design questions, market experts, and the public. We began covering emissions with the 2013 emissions year, and our program establishes a hard declining cap on the major sources of statewide emissions in California, and it creates a strong economic incentive for investments in cleaner and more efficient technologies. Each entity, like in the EU ETS covered by our program, has a compliance obligation that is set by its greenhouse gas emissions, and they must surrender instruments to match those emissions at the end of a compliance period. We create allowances equal to the cap, the total amount of permissible emissions, and that declines each year. And like everyone else, one allowance equals 1 metric ton of greenhouse gas emissions. Because our cap declines, fewer allowances are created each year, and overall emissions have to decrease over time. We have an auctioning mechanism that helps with price discovery, I'll describe in a later slide, we're a little bit different from the EU from learning some of those experiences. We have a minimum floor price, but that creates a steadily increasing price signal to invest in cleaner technologies. And it really helps facilitate addressing lowest cost reductions first, which is important for the economy. The program is one of our overall measures, as I mentioned before, and it helps us to reach our goals at a lower cost, which is also something we have to do by law. And it allows us to work in complement with other climate policies and with other jurisdictions. So we're currently linked with our partners in Quebec. You know, we've had great partnerships with folks like Mexico, many discussions with Colombia and others. And again, that's the favorite part of my job. Some quick facts and figures. Our program, we consider it to be economy-wide. We cover 80% of California's emissions. We derive those emissions information from annual third-party verified reported data. The program covers large emitters with greater than 25,000 metric tons CO2e per year. We also cover all emissions associated with electricity imports. We cover emissions from our natural gas suppliers and from our transportation fuel suppliers. So really buildings and transport, which transportation is our largest source in California. We've achieved high levels of compliance to date. 100% of entities with a compliance obligation last year met their obligations on our November 1 deadline. And our big compliance event coming up this year will cover all remaining emissions from 2018, 2019, and 2020. Through our auction mechanism, we've generated more than $14.8 billion that's being reinvested into the California economy through our California Climate Investments Program. And more than 50% of those revenues have gone to benefit disadvantaged communities. All right, some figures. Establishing caps, as Vicki mentioned, is critically important for a cap and trade program. This figure shows our caps through 2030. Our regulation actually establishes them through 2050, but that's really important to show how we'll get to our long-term reductions. This slide shows the annual allowance budgets through 2030 and the overall budgets and how they're broken down, how we distribute those allowances. We have cost containment strategic reserves, similar to the EU. We have allowances that are freely allocated for very specific purposes and allowances that are auctioned. Allocated allowances are based on benchmarking and are allocated for two very specific purposes. Like in the EU, we must mitigate carbon leakage. So we allocate to industrial sources to mitigate carbon leakage. We also allocate to our natural gas and electric rate utilities to minimize ratepayer impact. The caps were set based on our greenhouse gas inventory and data at the beginning of the program, and they've had about a 2% decline every year. The newest caps through 2030 and beyond are based on existing data and modeling and have a much steeper decline, a 4% decline through 2030. Most of our allowances go to auction. We have a minimum floor price of $17.71 this year. That increases by 5% plus inflation. And the state-owned allowances are shown in blue on this slide. And the allowances from our utilities are also required to be consigned to auction to benefit ratepayers, and those are shown in green. Finally, we have a new feature from our legislature, a hard price ceiling shown in black to prevent price volatility. The program is designed to provide compliance flexibility, which leads to cost-effective reductions. Covered entities may reduce emissions, purchase allowances at the auction or secondary markets, and use a very limited number of offset credits. The offsets usage limit restricts the quantity to 8% through 2020 emissions and decreases to 4% starting with 2021 emissions. So it further decreases going forward. We have very strict offset protocols. Those are described here. To date, we've issued about 220 million offset credits. And although we don't publish direct figures, that's about a $2 billion value for climate finance. We have other mechanisms to ensure flexibility, like banking limits subject to strict holding limits, as well as multi-year compliance periods. Finally, we have market integrity is really important for any market. So enforcement mechanisms to prevent undue holding or market power, strict registration and disclosure requirements, and financial penalties and enforcement. My last slide is just some resources. And on our next steps, we're really looking towards our carbon neutrality goals by 2045. So our next scoping plan will be assessing our full climate portfolio package and what's the best path for us to go forward. cap and trade will continue to play a very important part of that. Look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. So I will call now David Colin. David is the operations manager at Mexico 2, a company of the Mexican Stock Exchange, where he leads and participates in consultancy projects on carbon pricing mechanisms. He also promotes the liquidity of the voluntary carbon market in Mexico through the commercialization of certified carbon credits. He has a background in sustainability, renewable energy, and environmental economics. David has been in charge of the development of an emissions trading system roadmap at a national level, and recently he is involved in the design of carbon taxes for subnational jurisdictions. He participates in capacity building for the private and public sector on topics related to carbon markets, renewable energy projects financing, and clean energy certificates. David, thank you very much for joining us today. You have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Well, first of all, my apologies. I'm having some technical issues with starting my camera, but well, I'm gonna continue. Well, good afternoon to all of you. It is my pleasure to be here with you. Thanks to all the organizers of the event and also for the invitation. My name is David and I work for Mexico CO2, the Mexican Carbon Platform, which is a company part of the Mexican Stock Exchange, where we promote the development of environmental markets. The Mexican Stock Exchange is very committed to the development and supporting of market instruments, because a private sector that is more prepared to face climate change is more valued to its investors. And also because if no action is taken against climate change, it will highly risk the overall economic development of our countries. So why an ETS was implemented in Mexico? Well, I think itself from GIZ was already saying some reasons, but I would recall just a couple of them. First of all, for the achievement of mitigation goals according to the Mexican NDCs. And number two, because an ETS, a carbon market, is a cost-effective way to reduce emissions for the market participants. So with this in mind, let's briefly review some of the most important technical aspects of the Mexican ETS on its first stage, the pilot phase. The program officially started on January 1st of last year with a pilot phase, and it is going to be fully implemented operational in 2023, going through a transitional phase starting on 2022. After an analysis of the Mexican emissions profile of different sectors, its characteristics, and also considering emissions mitigation goals, it was announced that the coverage of the program includes the whole energy sector and the industry, mostly as other jurisdictions, as mentioned from the EU ETS and also from California. For the pilot phase, the only greenhouse gas covered is carbon dioxide. The emission threshold for participation was determined to be 100,000 tons of CO2 and above. This means that about 300 facilities from about 60 to 70 companies will be surrendering and exchanging allowances and also acquiring carbon credits under this program. The covered emissions under this national ETS will represent about 37% out of the total national emissions. The allocation allowances for the pilot phase, which was announced at the beginning of this year, was based under the grandparenting method, and such allowances will be provided for free. It's going to be 100% free allocation to all participants, only during the pilot phase. For the upcoming operative phase in 2023, auctions could take place in the allocation rules. Here. The cap for the first year of the program was determined in 271 millions of tons of CO2. And for this year, 2021, the number will increase actually to 273.1 million tons of CO2. In theory, this cap will reach a peak year during the operative phase. And since then, a reduction of the level of the cap will take place, also considering the business as usual scenario. This program counts with flexibility mechanisms such as the use of offset, and which will allow participants to comply with 10% of their obligations through carbon credits generated from uncovered sectors. So, for example, credits generated by the energy or industrial sectors will not be eligible, but forestry projects or transportation or perhaps other sectors will actually be eligible for this component of the flexibility mechanism. Another flexibility mechanisms are early actions. Banking will be allowed during the operative phase only if participants comply with their obligations during the pilot phase. On December last year, the Ministry of Environment, SEMARNAT, they published the allocation rules and also the criteria, as mentioned before. On January this year, an official announcement of the allocation was released in the official gazette. So these are all the main characteristics of the national Mexican ETS that also itself, from Jason mentioned, this is the first national level ETS here in America, and we're very proud of it and working towards the achievement of mitigation goals in Mexico. And we're very happy to transfer all of experience and support to any jurisdiction in Latin America.
Thank you very much, David. I think I called you David. So thank you, David.
It's okay, Caroline.
Sometimes I call myself Caroline to make it easier when translating as well. But okay, well, thank you once again. And moving on, we are now calling Jose Francisco Chari Ruiz, who is the current Director of Climate Change and Climate Risk at the Colombian Ministry of Environment. He has more than 18 years of experience in the design, implementation, management, and evaluation of environmental and social projects aimed at improving business productivity and industry competitiveness. He is an expert in climate change, environmental and energy management at the corporate level, among others. He graduated as a mechanical engineer from the University of America Foundation and has a master's degree in environmental and energy management in organizations from the University of La Rioja in Spain, and a specialization in business administration from the Sergio Arboleda University. He has worked as a consultant at the IDB, as an expert in the development of energy savings valuation methodologies, and as a specialist in climate change mitigation, energy efficiency, and carbon finance, among others. Jose Francisco, it's a pleasure to have you here. Please, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you everyone here for sharing with us these topics and this important space to talk about the carbon markets, the carbon pricing mechanisms, and other options that is really important for our region at this moment. You know, we are working to comply with our commitments with the Paris Agreement and other things associated with the call that the science is making in terms to reduce emissions for the world. In this case, we are going to talk about the carbon pricing in Colombia, carbon pricing mechanism that we are implementing here. We are moving just right now with a carbon tax. We have currently a carbon tax implemented with several results during this process, but we are trying to move now in our ETS. We are moving to develop our national system to comply with our goals. Let me share with you my screen. Okay. Can you confirm me if you are seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, our experience developing this kind of instruments starting several years ago. We start with our climate change policy, in which we establish specific lines to work searching our low carbon development. In this case, we establish some specific strategies to comply with that. After this climate policy, which was submitted in 2015, we established in 2016 through the law 1819 our national carbon tax. This is our first instrument in carbon pricing mechanism, in which we tax the consumption of fossil fuel is the taxable assumption. In this case, we develop an additional instrument, which is the carbon neutrality mechanism. This instrument was regulated 1 year after that, in which we included the option to avoid the tax complying or demonstrating the carbon neutrality of the fuel consumption. In this case, after that, we established the ratification of the Paris Agreement by a specific regulation in our country, establishing the basis for the work in the next years. After that, we developed our climate change law in 2018, in which we defined the possibility to use or to have our national program of tradable carbon emission quotas. This is the beginning of our ETS, the process that we are starting at this moment. After that, we defined through the resolution 1447 in 2018, the basis for national accountability of emission reductions. This is through some specific platform that we designed for that, which is called RENARE. RENARE is our national registry for emissions. In this registry, we include some specific things associated for the compliance are the instrument. This is the instrument that we use to guarantee the compliance of our carbon tax and the carbon neutrality mechanisms associated to that. Our carbon tax is our first approach to this kind of mechanism. The main characteristics of this tax is the tax is over the carbon content of the fossil fuels. This means that the use of this kind of fossil fuels in Colombia is applied this kind of overcost associated to the tax. It's important to have in mind that the tax is only applicable to some liquid fossil fuels, such as gasoline, oils, diesel oil, jet fuel, other kind of some kinds of natural gas, not applicable for domestic use, only for residential use, sorry, is applicable only for the natural gas for some specific industrial applications. In this kind, having this in mind, the taxable event inside our carbon tax is the sale of the fossil fuels. And even we include the subtractions or the possible leakage from this kind of the importation of the fossil fuels too. All those events are included in our carbon tax. The subjects to the taxable applicability are the producer or the importer of the fossil fuels here in Colombia. The producer or importer are included as user too, in case that they are using some specific portion of the fossil fuel for their own consumption. In addition, the responsibles for this tax are the producers are important through all the chain value of the fossil fuels. In this case, it's important to have in mind that the passive subjects, that is the final users of the fossil fuels, in this case has the specific regulation to apply to the no compensation or the exemption of the carbon tax, that is the carbon neutrality mechanism. To have in consideration, the carbon tax have at this moment a tax rate. The tax rate is starting something like $3.5 per ton, the equivalent of 3.5 equivalents per ton of CO2. but this value is increased in the time. Every year is increased, considering the cost of value, the cost of life in the country and the inflation of the country. At this moment, the current rate is associated or is real close to 4.5 or $6 per ton of CO2. This is the equivalent of the carbon tax. This means that this is the floor that we put to the possibility to compensate or to reduce or to apply to the no consumption of the carbon tax. How is working the carbon tax? We have two possibilities to apply. One, to pay the tax at the moment that you are using the fossil fuel, or to apply to a carbon neutrality mechanism. Considering that in this case, the user or the final consumer is who is paying for this added value at the price of the fossil fuel. This mechanism works through a passive subject. In this case, is a major dealer of the fossil fuel, which is the connection between the user, the final user or the final consumer, and the responsibility of the tax, which is the producer of the importer. In this case, the passive subject is who is in charge to prepare all documents or to make the process to apply to a carbon neutrality mechanism in order to not to cause the tax. To not to cause the tax or to apply to a carbon neutrality mechanism, we define several rules throughout this specific regulation. In this case, the first thing is we identify some specific projects or some specific initiatives that can apply or that generate emission reductions to be used for the carbon neutrality, in this case for the combustible, for the fossil fuel usage. And they need, or the passive subject to apply needs to demonstrate that these initiatives belongs or are being or was developed considering some specific certification program or some specific carbon standard. This means that you need to demonstrate that the project activity that generates the emission reduction is a reality and comply with the most specific and most strict standards and rules they've designed for that. So those reductions can be demonstrated or can be analyzed under the control of the validation and verification bodies, which needs to certify the results of the emission reductions before to be used. In 3 years of operation of our carbon neutrality mechanisms, we have interested numbers because at this moment we have more than 3,000 applications for carbon neutrality or requests for carbon neutrality, covering more than 42 million of tons of CO2 that provides from different initiatives. In this moment, 84% are related with domestic initiatives because since 2018 we closed our process only to use or only to permit the use emission reductions obtained locally. This means that the initiatives, more than 100 initiatives that we have, belongs for different sectors: energy projects, renewable energy projects, sustainable projects in transport or in waste handling, industry, mainly in energy efficiency, or the forestry industry. In this case, if you can see in the middle of the screen, the graphic shows that the most important representation on the results applied for the carbon neutrality mechanism belongs for the forestry sector. And this includes new forestry projects and RED projects in this case, or avoided deforestation projects. In addition, the mechanisms show us the possibility to develop a new services associated to this kind of carbon markets or these voluntary carbon markets. In this case, some actors in the process define or identify the possibility to generate some group of representatives, and in this case creates a Carbono as a foundation that represents the interests of different actors in the market in Colombia. In addition, this process permits for us to work to have a specific or create specific working groups with the national taxation authority, or the tax authority in this case, which is responsible for the handling of the processing in the country, and other actors that has important representative and role inside this kind of process. In addition, we work mainly permanently in the capacity building process, explaining the carbon tax working, how to apply to a no causation mechanism, and how to develop this kind of projects. After this process with our carbon tax, we are trying to move in our new process, which is include our new ETS. This process is starting on 2017 and 2018 with the decision making, in which we find the need to establish an emission trading system. And this was reflected in our climate change law, in which we include a specific article defining the need to advance in this kind of emission trading system throughout a national program for the tradable carbon emission quotes. And we define the roadmap to design this kind of system, this kind of programs over the time. The recent years, mainly 2019 and 2020, we implemented the stage 1 of this roadmap, which is the preparation that our ETEs by formulating, and in this case, specific guidelines, specific rules for the design of this kind of process, of this kind of program. This process has been supported by the PMR and different corporations in which we obtain technical support for develop all these kind of activities. Now, the next steps, considering 2020, part of these steps that we are making just right now, we are completing the design of our program. We are preparing other simulation courses about the carbon market. The last year, we developed one simulation course, the carbon market. In addition, for this year, we are trying to identify the specific regulation that we need to develop for the management and negotiation with the sectors, or even to establish the rules that we are going to use for the specific operation of our carbon national emission trading system. In addition, we are working in the preparation of the technological infrastructure, identify the possibilities, the needs, and the most important thing, the options that we have to use these kind of technologies to guarantee that the full operation of our system. The program will be released in 2022, but this is not totally true, because the time that we are identifying, making the review of other experiences in the region or even internationally are related, well, we will need more time, maybe 2 or 3 years additional, in order to create capacities, to establish an specific rules and to fully understand what is happening with what will happen. We will have an emission trading system, and how the other sectors we are going to be affected with that. And we expected to have the implementation of a pilot program in 2 or 3 years approximately. Just right now, we are working in policies, development policies associated with the carbon tax and the relation with the carbon neutrality mechanism, and the relation that we will have with the ETS, the institutional arrangements, creating capacities, creating options to work with that, identify which sectors, which gases, greenhouse gases, will be covered by our ETS, preparing the rules to define the caps, the types and levels of projects, the allocation, how we are going to do these kinds of allocations, and the flexibility or other things associated, for example, the prices, cost, or even a sanction regime associated for the incompliance of this kind of process. We are moving just right now in this, exploring this second phase of our carbon pricing mechanism, trying to develop this ETS in the short time, taking advantage of experiences that has different countries such as Mexico. Mexico, for example, is moving really fast with their ETS. We are trying to get this kind of experiences to replicate in our ETS. I think this is all. Thank you. If you have any question, please don't hesitate to show me at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose Francisco. And I take this opportunity to encourage everyone in the audience to post questions on our Q&A desk. We haven't got many so far. So moving on, we are calling now Lina Lee. Lina is a senior manager at the Secretariat of the International Carbon Action Partnership, the ICAP, with more than 10 years of career experience in carbon markets, low emissions development, and climate and foreign policy. She is in charge of the political outreach, technical dialogues, and capacity building activities of the partnership with a focus on China and the wider Asia-Pacific region. She also oversees other consulting, research, and dialogue projects, in particular related to developing countries. Thank you very much, Lina. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see it now. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the lab, the IB and GIZ and all the organizers. And it's my great pleasure to join you in the second series of the webinar, and my colleague Steph actually joined the first one. So we are really happy that we would accompany such a nice journey, even though remotely. Today, I'm gonna share with you some of the insights into the relatively long journey of emission trading in development in China, which actually is started from different regional pilots, and now we are seeing a national carbon market emerging. Just to introduce a little bit our institution, the International Carbon Action Partnership is a multilateral government-to-government platform that focusing exclusively on the mandatory carbon trade systems. And since our founding in 2007, we now have 23 members and 5 observers from all the 4 continents that covering all the major ETS jurisdictions, for example, including Mexico. We have 3 major types of activities: technical dialogue, knowledge sharing, and capacity building. For example, in the past 2 to 3 years, we have organized various ETS academies. Maybe some of you have been participating in them in Latin American countries like Mexico and Colombia, together with our partners like World Bank PMR and GIZ. So we are really looking forward to watch the further development of emissions trading within the Latin American region and within Brazil as well. Looking forward to expand our activities in collaboration with more partners. Now, back to China, the other part of the world. The country, as you all know, is the largest greenhouse gas emitter and the second largest economy of the world. And it has enjoyed high speed of industrialization, urbanization, and motorization. And that also means that all the high-speed economic development in the past 30 plus years has created increasing environmental pressure, and that also include its climate footprint. The country is in a continuous reform and transformation process. The top leadership has set a country to really strive to achieve ecological civilization, which means to strive the balance of the economic development with the broader sustainable development agenda. And that also means that we are committed to a low carbon future. And also, like many developing and emerging economies, the country has an energy system that rely very heavily on fossil fuel, and its electricity sector is also highly regulated. So the transformation of the energy system and the reform of the electricity market actually come into play also when we talk about climate change policy and also emission trading in particular. the country has a policy framework that is embedding its climate change targets as a major strategy for the broader economic social development. And China's broader economic and social development actually is outlined in the country's 5-year plans, with mandatory targets in different topical areas, including energy saving and climate change. And here I outlined you some of the recent 5-year plans from the until the most recent one just released last month on the 14th 5-year plan. Bear in mind that when China started this journey on exploring emission trading as a mitigation instrument for the country, we were only at the beginning of the 12th 5-year plan. At that time, China had I think Copenhagen pledge for 2020, but the policy framework was not developed as shown slide. What I want to show you on this slide, not going into the detail, is to show that indeed, first of all, the country has benefited by participating in the international CDM scheme, where there was a lot of initial learning. There was also a lot of players who were involved in the CDM projects, which later on played an important role in the emission trading pilots regions. And there was a policy turning point around 2010 when the country started to take up more domestic climate and energy target, and the country traditionally relied on command and control targets, and the government recognized that the cost is relatively high, and they would like to explore a market-based approach such as emission trading to control the cost, as Vicky outlined, and also Jason, that it is a major attractiveness for the government. At the same time, they also realized that there are major regions in the middle and West China which might form a base of a sustainability project that has mitigation and other sustainability and social benefits that could benefit by supplying so-called domestic offsets. So these are the major two motivations for the government to take up emissions trading. At that time, actually, there was a dual debate about which carbon pricing instruments, so carbon tax was not excluded, but the Development Reform Commission, which is a very powerful planning ministry or super ministry in China, actually was taking up emission trading and launched the 7 ETS pilots in the regions, and that actually kicked off a piloting operation since 2013, which are still going on in now 7+1 regions in China. And the national ETS preparation actually also started around 2015. So here you have a map of China, and you see that we have this 8 different regional markets, and the government actually selected these regions quite carefully. They represent different geographies, different types of economic and emissions profile, and different levels of economic and social developments. So the government wanted to use regional pilots to test how emissions trading would work under this different, very diversified regional context in China, because once you have a national level policy, it needs to accommodate different regional situations. Another reason for choosing a very diverse different region is which I will show you in the next slide, is for the regions to really try to select different design elements, as we learned from also previous presentation and also the previous webinar. There are different parameters and elements that ETS requires the policymakers to really select a certain option, and the different regions actually has selected quite diversified design options, so that to test all the different options, how it actually happens in reality. To briefly summarize, regarding sectors that covered all the region pilots cover both power and industry sector, also 2 very commonly covered sectors under other ETS systems. Some of them, especially the municipalities, those located in the eastern part of China are more developed and already past the industrialization phase. And they also tend to cover building and transport because these are the two major emission contributors to their economy. And they cover these sectors to ensure that the ETS covers a large amount of their regional carbon emissions, which varies depending on the pilots between 30 to 50%. And you also see that you have a different thresholds ranging from around 5,000 tons of CO2, like 20 or even higher. And the reason is, again, because in the large industrial base, let's call it like in Chongqing and Guangdong, you have large emitters emitting and companies, and in the municipalities, you tend to have smaller ones. So again, this is a very regional-based choice. And of course, in any emission trading, one of the key questions is allocation. And here is that there's a mixture of free allocation where there is indeed a very strong trend of starting from grandparenting to gradually introduce also benchmarking. And in one region, which is Guangdong, they also started very early at the first pilot to try with auctioning. And they also are one of the largest regarding trading volume and liquidity market. And that really sees how auctioning actually helps the market to function and to find the price signal that the ETS was designed for. But you also see that other regions, especially in the recent years, also try to take up auctioning as a way of allocation. I think previous speakers also talking about flexibility. Indeed, all the regions has allowed banking and have not allowed borrowing. All the regions also allowed offsets, as I said, domestic offsets. The reason were exactly the same as Vicky outlined, when to provide compliance entities a less expensive compliance cost to ease their burden. And second is to tape in, as I said, the broader sustainability potential around different sectors in China, especially in the middle and the west, and also in particular sectors that the region is of concern. For example, the forestry sector in Fujian. Then to develop such an offset program to allow this additional mitigation and sustainability benefits to be generated by the demand created by the emissions trading. So the range of the offsets allow percentages between 5 to 10%. As I also mentioned, this CCER program is a national level one, so it was not designed by the regional pilots, but managed at the national government. But there are two regions who actually started their regional offsets program as well. As I mentioned, Fujian is one, and there is also Guangdong. There is a standardized annual reporting, third-party verification, and there's a mixture of financial and non-financial penalties. An interesting thing in China is that all the pilots has achieved almost 100% compliance, especially in the later year. In the earlier compliance year, there was a lot of communication, stakeholder engagement, capacity building. And especially in the municipalities, due to that, a lot of entities included in their ETS are smaller, medium-sized entities. That's why they really spend a lot of time to engage with this industry, make sure they understand how surrenderance and monitoring reporting and so on works. Overall, this years of piloting experience actually build a pathway towards the national carbon market policy. There was a lot of confidence generated because before that, when China started the piloting mandate in 2011, and all the pilots gradually getting on board 2013 and 2014, emission trading are still concentrated mainly among OECD countries. So there was a question mark like whether this relatively complicated policy instrument is viable for and that confidence has been built. And as I said, different design options has been tested, and there is a very vivid learning and interaction process among the regional governments and their various advisors, so technical supporting institutions, markets, service providers, and so on. And again, also as previous speakers has mentioned, we have seen a very dynamic ecosystem emerging of different carbon market players and actors. If you think you have different government department, and you have the operators of the registry of the trading platform and exchange, and then you have the verifiers, you have the consultancy firm coming in to help country to do monitoring and reporting. Some of the companies also form their own sub-branch to look into carbon management and so on. So you really have a very dynamic ecosystem building around emission trading in the regions. And actually 2 pilot regions, Hubei and Shanghai, have been also selected to task to develop a registry and trading for the national ETS. So not only are they providing like policy blueprints or options for the national policy making, but they also participate in the national ETS development. And here again, it's a key milestone. Emission trading is as previous speakers also mentioned, it is a complicated policy tool, and for a country like China, it's extra challenging to accommodate it in the existing policy framework and the central and region and different sector contexts. So in 2013, to recap, the regional pilots.
Lina, sorry, I'll have to interrupt you because we need to wrap up. If you
okay. So here, the main development in the past 2 to 3 years, what I want to highlight is that there is a transfer of responsibility from the National Development Reform Commission to the Ministry of Environment and Ecology. That also has implication to the current design of the national ETS. And the second thing is, perhaps you all know, last year in September, the national government and the president set up ambition for China to achieve carbon emission peaking by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. And that really provided a lot of momentum for the policy development. So we saw a lot of documents and policy on emissions trading coming in Q3 and Q4, and also in the past months this year. So again, it's needed to see China's carbon market development, the all mitigation targets, and how to align them together. To briefly go through, we have a bottom-up intensity-based cap. We cover the national ETS, cover power generation sector, which is a threshold of 26,000 tons of emissions per year, around 2,225 entities. And at the beginning, at the current stage is 100% fair allocation. There is indication of introducing auctioning later on. And the compliance is also limited with financial fines. And there is allowance of 5% of CCERs. And we have following the overall environment management in China multi-level governance. Looking forward, we are having the timeline for the first compliance circle confirmed to be finishing all the 2019 and 2020 compliance need to be finished by end of December this year. We have several key policies that is still unfolding, and the emission trading and in the process to also adjust to this new policy and new targets. And in the future, in the rest of this year and the coming years in the 14th five-year plan, we are looking to have the council level legislation to provide a more robust legal basis. We know that the government has been preparing more sectors to be included in the national ETS major industry sector and aviation. And we expect that the system will gradually move from bottom up to a top down cap, and also transition of the regional pilots into a more unified national ETS. And that's all.
Thank you very much, Lina. Mudando para o português agora, vou chamar o Guido Penido. O Guido é economista pela UFRJ e mestre em economia pela FGV. Foi pesquisador na Fundação Getúlio Vargas, consultor na Secretaria de Política Econômica do Ministério da Fazenda, coordenador técnico do projeto PMR Brasil, e atualmente é consultor no Banco Mundial. Nos últimos anos atuou na área de economia da mudança do clima, com foco em sistemas de precificação de carbono. Guido, muito obrigada. Você tem a palavra.
Bem, boa tarde a todos. Peço desculpas aí aos nossos amigos panelistas. Vou falar em português dessa vez. Posso falar em português, né, Carolina? Não precisa falar em inglês, não, né? Tá ótimo.
Fica à vontade.
Bem, inicialmente, contar aí para a nossa plateia que não temos um sistema, estamos, enfim, num estágio de implementação de um sistema de comércio de emissão que ainda está bem atrás do que nossos colegas colocaram nas respectivas jurisdições. Começamos aí, acho que com uma ordem cronológica, né, com a Europa, que já tem algo bem estabelecido, passando por Califórnia, México, Colômbia, chegando na China, que já teve os pilotos subnacionais e começando esse ano nacional. E aqui no Brasil a gente não tem um sistema de precificação de carbono implementado. O que a gente tem é algo estilizado ali no RenovaBio, né, que pode ser considerado uma forma estilizada de precificação, mas uma jabuticaba nacional com, enfim, diversas peculiaridades, que eu não vou entrar em detalhe do RenovaBio, que não o objetivo aqui. O que a gente teve, como também tiveram China, México e Colômbia, foi o programa PMR Brasil. Enfim, eles tiveram o PMR dos respectivos países, né, no qual a gente estudou a implementação de sistemas de precificação de carbono, como carbon taxes, enfim, tributos de carbono e sistemas de comércio de emissões, mas ao contrário daqueles países nos quais o PMR levou à implementação de fato de um instrumento, no Brasil o PMR levou à criação de um roadmap para a implementação, né, um passo a passo, um guia para a implementação, e foi um programa de diversos anos, em parceria com o Ministério da Economia, entre o Banco Mundial e o Ministério da Economia. Enfim, aqui eu vou passar muito brevemente por algumas das recomendações que a gente teve, que a gente inclui nesse roadmap, mas eu vou colocar aí no chat o link. Todos os relatórios técnicos do PMR, dezenas de relatórios, estão disponíveis, publicamente disponíveis no site do Ministério da Economia. Depois eu boto o link para quem tiver interesse. Tá ok? Então, como eu falei, vou passar bem brevemente por um pouco do trabalho que a gente fez e quais foram os principais resultados dele, né? Em termos dos building blocks que a gente tem para implementar um sistema de comércio de emissões, no Brasil, acho que a gente tem algum trabalho a fazer em cada um desses, né? A gente não tem um sistema de ARV, por exemplo, que é algo necessário para um sistema de comércio de emissões ou para um carbon tax. A gente não tem um MRV organizacional mandatório ainda no país. Seria um primeiro passo muito importante para desenvolver aí a base de dados e dar credibilidade para o sistema. E com certeza é um gargalo que a gente tem. A gente deve desenvolver no futuro próximo, não só para um sistema de precificação de carbono, mas, enfim, num mundo em que as emissões de gases de efeito de estufa são parâmetro-chave para tomada de decisão, a gente precisa ter esse tipo de informação para guiar nossos investimentos e avaliação de políticas públicas em geral. Tá? E aí no PMR a gente concentrou muito nas outras caixinhas aqui, principalmente os elementos de desenho, quais são exatamente as formas de precificação que seriam mais apropriadas para o país, qual seria o desenho desse instrumento, como seria o arcabouço institucional e o marco regulatório, que a Caroline, inclusive, nos ajudou com isso, ajustes em instrumentos para deixar o arcabouço de políticas mais harmonioso, mais eficiente, também o engajamento de stakeholders. Como eu falei, a gente ainda tem bastante trabalho para fazer em cada uma dessas caixinhas, algumas mais, outras menos, mas, enfim, é um trabalho em andamento. Tá ok? Aqui alguns princípios norteadores, muito rapidamente para vocês, que a gente identificou. Primeiro, a priorização de um sistema de comércio de emissões e não um tributo de carbono. Aqui a gente fez algumas análises técnicas, mas no fim do dia essa escolha foi muito mais política do que técnica. A gente sabe que no Brasil a gente tem um arcabouço tributário muito complexo, extremamente overcomplicated, né, como a gente fala, enfim, também bastante oneroso, né? Então, acho que falar sobre tributos no Brasil gera uma certa alergia em todo mundo que a gente falava. Então, tanto dentro dos nossos diálogos dentro do governo quanto do setor privado, era um deal breaker falar sobre tributos. Então, foi muito fácil a nossa escolha por um sistema de comércio de emissões, nesse caso, que tinha uma aceitação muito maior e uma viabilidade política também muito maior. Tá? Segundo, implementação gradual, e acho que aí o sistema de comércio de emissões também dá uma flexibilidade dinâmica maior por não estar abaixo da legislação tributária, que já é mais engessada, né? A gente planeja uma implementação faseada desse instrumento, começando com uma primeira fase com um desenho mais simples e uma ambição mais modesta para aprendizado, desenvolvimento de instituições e bases de dados, E aí, a partir das fases de compliance do sistema, a gente pode ir rebuscando esse sistema. Eu vou citar aqui, por exemplo, a questão da alocação de permissões, que já citaram aí, que normalmente é começada com grandfathering, depois transiciona para um benchmarking. Aqui a gente está falando exatamente da mesma coisa. A gente, numa primeira fase, não espera ter todos os dados necessários para fazer um benchmarking, então a gente começaria com a alocação gratuita bastante ampla, por grandfathering, e aí transicionaria ao longo das frases para um regime com um benchmarking para alocação gratuita e cada vez maior percentual de emissões leiloadas. Tá? E a gente também fortaleceria durante essa primeira fase dados e informações em instituições, como as necessárias para operar o sistema, e principalmente aí os dados de MRV. Tá? Proteção à competitividade, acho que no momento atual, que a gente está de crise bastante forte no Brasil, a gente não tem como começar um novo instrumento sem pensar nisso. Então, como que a gente lida com as receitas que podem ser eventualmente angariadas com a precificação, como que a gente vai fazer essa reciclagem, como que a gente consegue diminuir os custos de conformidade com mecanismos de flexibilidade, como é o caso dos offsets que já foram citados aí, quais são os pontos de regulação, os limiares de regulação que são mais interessantes para reduzir os custos regulatórios e não onerar excessivamente as pequenas empresas, conseguindo ter uma representatividade de emissões legal, né? Enfim, analisamos todas essas questões. Previsibilidade e estabilidade, acho que isso é crucial para permitir investimentos de longo prazo, ter uma estabilidade regulatória, com comprometimento de longo prazo e sinal forte do governo para ter um sistema resiliente. A gente também teria aí, em termos de estabilidade, um mecanismo de estabilização de preços, como se fosse um price collar, né, com piso e teto, e uma reserva de estabilidade, como também foi citado pela Europa e pela Califórnia. E aqui já falei, a reciclagem de receitas. A gente não quer que esse instrumento tenha fins arrecadatórios, seja um instrumento com finalidade meramente fiscal, né? A gente quer que esse instrumento tenha uma finalidade extrafiscal de corrigir uma externalidade, de reduzir emissões de gases de efeito estufa, enquanto sendo capaz de promover aí um desenvolvimento socioeconômico interessante para o país numa direção que o mundo está tomando, que é um desenvolvimento mais verde. E, por sinal, que é uma agenda que nós podemos ter diversas vantagens competitivas por nossas aptidões naturais do Brasil, como, enfim, nosso amplo ativo florestal, nossa matriz energética bastante limpa. Tá, então, alguns destaques aqui. A gente tem a proposta, nesse roadmap que eu citei, de criação de um sistema de comércio de emissões nacional, tá? Que pode vir a ser linkado com outros sistemas no futuro, mas, a princípio, no primeiro momento nacional, por meio de um projeto de lei elaborado pelo Executivo. Né? A gente analisou a possibilidade de regulamentar o MBRE, da Política Nacional de Mudança do Clima, que inclusive está com um projeto de lei agora, mas a gente achou que o sistema de comércio de emissões, por tratar de emissões, não de redução de emissões, e também para dar mais legitimidade para esse processo, deveria ser feito por projeto de lei, não por decreto. E aí, como eu falei, seria uma implementação gradual, com uma primeira fase com ambição modesta, aplicada aí primeiramente ao setor industrial, com mecanismo para dar flexibilidade e garantir a competitividade. E aí, enfim, com um arcabouço institucional que, enfim, aí uma preferência talvez até do governo, que seja ancorado na administração pública para ter, enfim, possibilidade de aplicação de penalidades e toda essa questão de poder de polícia, mas com forte participação privada. A gente olhou aí para a questão dos mercados de energia, participação de órgãos privados, olhando um pouco para a Califórnia também, que tem lá o WCI, né, se eu não me engano, a sigla. Então, a gente queria ter uma participação privada na operação desse mercado, enfim, na plataforma de transações e etc. E aí, ao longo das fases do sistema, como eu falei, tentando ampliar tanto o rebuscamento técnico desse sistema, quanto a ambição. Então, a gente pode ir reduzindo o cap, como foi feito na Califórnia e na Europa, e em todos os sistemas normalmente no mundo, ampliando o escopo dessa regulação, enfim, incluir mais setores nessa regulação para tentar tornar ele mais eficiente, mais economy-wide, como é a nossa NDC, e transicionar os métodos de alocação também. São 3 aspectos aí. Acho que o principal gargalo que eu já citei foi a questão do sistema de MRV. Queria destacar que o Ministério de Ciência e Tecnologia já tem um programa, na verdade foi um grupo de trabalho que foi finalizado e deve começar em breve, um programa de inventários de emissões organizacionais, ainda numa base voluntária, mas aí esse projeto de lei que a gente está fazendo essa previsão para um SE poderia, eventualmente, não necessariamente, a gente pode ter um projeto de lei antes para o sistema de MRV nacional, já que ele tem outros objetivos que não só servir ao SE, mas poderia, em última instância, esse PL já prevê a criação desse sistema de MRV mandatório. Tá? Então, como eu falei, eu vou deixar o link para os estudos do projeto aqui e fico à disposição aí para perguntas.
Obrigada, Guido. Bem, vou passar para o inglês agora de novo, para a gente falar das perguntas. In our Q&A session, which is actually going to be very short because we are running out of time, I will make a general question for all the participants and a very specific one for Jason from California. From Jason Gray. There's also a question for Guido here. But I think the challenge here is that we have 15 minutes to close the webinar. So I will ask our panelists to really keep their answers short to up to 2 minutes. And I will have to really cut you off because we can't really go much farther than 4 p.m. So I'm going to ask Jason his question and then everyone else's question, and then you can just jump in and answer at the order you prefer, right? So Jason, there's a question here about the offsets limits. Why are they so strict? And also about the role played by forests in California's cap and trade scheme. So can you give examples of projects or policies for carbon reduction of the forestry sector in California? And then a specific question for Guido as well. When do you see that if there is any perspective for the executive branch to forward the bill of law? And one question for all the participants, this comes from the Q&A as well, from Celso Leme, but his question was very specific to Brazil. I will expand this to the other countries. I will ask, what were the main challenges faced in the implementation of the ETS in each of your jurisdictions, or what are the challenges that are being faced at the moment, or that you envisage in the next future? And of course, because here we have different stages of implementation, and including Brazil in this question as well. So I guess the overall question is, what challenges would you highlight that were that you had to face and or are still on the table for the continued implementation of each of your ETS? Okay, that's it. Now, I don't know who wants to start. Maybe you, Jason?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the question. I think for most ETSs, there's a limit on offsets if they're used. And really the purpose of that is, purpose of including offsets is really twofold. One, you're looking for a type of cost containment mechanism because offsets typically have some risk behind them. That means they typically trade for less than an allowance. So that's important for cost containment. The other purpose of having them is really to incentivize reductions in sectors that are not covered by your cap. So making sure you're getting a wide range of emissions reductions or enhanced sequestration. Those are, for us, that's the purpose of having offsets. The purpose of having limits is you want to provide cost containment, but you really want to make sure that the price signal and that the activities are really happening within your sources that are covered by the sectors. So in California, we looked to other design like the Waxman-Markey bill, which was a federal proposal that looked at between 8 and 10%. We initially had a 4% limit in our initial design discussions, but because of the way our strategic reserve is set, we ended up making that an 8% limit to start with. Offsets are not without controversy. Some of it rightly so, some of it maybe not. We think that our program is designed very, very carefully, but because of the political ramifications of that controversy, they tend to be limited. Our legislature, starting with this year, has further limited them in California. So those are some of the political reasons. The forest program for us is also very important because that is one of the largest emitting sectors. It's one of the few areas that we don't cover by our cap. So forests are eligible to come in, land use is eligible to come in for an offsets program in California. Our program is applicable throughout the United States. So I believe we have forest projects in 37 or 38 states throughout the country, including very large, important projects with indigenous communities in the US. Those types of actions are avoided conversion, which is sort of like RED. They are improved forest management, so taking action to enhance sequestration, reduce fuel reduction or fuel risk for fires, and then some reforestation. We have very few reforestation projects, but those are the eligible project types in our program.
Thank you, Jason. Now maybe Vicky.
Yeah, so in terms of challenges, I think the biggest challenge for the EU, but for any system, is getting the stakeholder buy-in, the political support to get going. I think once you get going, there are challenges, but there's ways around them. And so you need to get going and learn by doing. In Europe, it happened because we were signed up to the Kyoto Protocol and we needed a policy, and stakeholders knew it was either going to be a tax or an ETS. And that helped build the support amongst business who preferred an ETS. And as you get going, people's interests are much more varied. So the stakeholder interests are much more varied and it's much easier to move forward. I think now that we have the Paris Agreement and parties have made commitments under their NDCs and are looking at policies to meet those NDCs, I think we're seeing a lot of development of carbon market ETS because it's a good approach. And I think it's just a question of stakeholders accepting we need something which works and what works best for the different stakeholders, for the winners and the losers.
Thank you, Vicky. Now, maybe Jose Francisco.
Thank you, Caroline. The huge challenge that maybe we are identifying in our ETS implementation are related with the credibility of the system that we are going to implement, because there is no previous reference here in the country, and it is necessary to create this kind of confidence about the results and the operation of the system. In addition, maybe we can identify other problems associated with the allocation that associated with the ETS, because we don't have the entire process designed. This means that it is necessary to establish new rules, new things, that it is necessary to work with the sectors. And you know, sectors are some difficult to consider in this kind of process, and how we're going to establish these caps, for example, and it is important to have the impact of the results that maybe we will have with the ETS to provide a complete overview for the sectors of different stakeholders during this process. And in addition, I think maybe some restriction about the finance of even the other support, technical support that maybe we will need associated with resources to implement the platform, or even to develop a specific regulation that will be necessary for the operation of the ETS. I think that are the main challenges that we are going to face in the closing years during the development and implementation of our ETS.
Thank you, Jose Francisco. David?
Yes, thank you, Carolina, for the question. I think some of the answers are already been said by the other components. But from my perspective, in the case of the Mexican ETS, one of the challenges was the development of the required and supporting systems, right? Such as the registry for the allowances, but also some transactional platforms. And also additional supporting components, for example, the development of the methodologies to develop carbon offsets projects. So I think those are like some challenges. Besides this, also in line with what Vicky was saying, I can mention that some of the potential participants in the ETS were showing some kind of resistance, but this can be addressed by constant communication between the regulators and also the companies regarding the importance of the program, right, in the environmental and also economic advantages in the middle and long term, so that certain entities can achieve by complying with their obligations.
Thank you, David. Lina?
Yeah, it's already a rich list, and I agree very much with a lot of the observations already. And I wanted to add on this list based on China's previous and current experience with how ETS the role gonna be and is in the overall policy mix. I think especially complicated for the case of China as a country of long years of both overarching and sectorial different types of command and control, voluntary information policies in the energy industry and all the sectors, and how moving forward there will be sectorial and regional level carbon emission peaking targets and policies. So how ETS will fit in the overall structure, and that links to a second very important challenge, which is governance. No policy. No policies will be good if you don't have a good and solid governance structure behind it. And we see from our previous speakers, especially Jason, Vicky, like we from China also learned a lot from their system by observing how their institutions are capable of managing and also continuously review and improving the policy. And that has been the case in China, that how the institutions are prepared from the public sector, from the service sector, from the covered entities. There's a steep learning curve that is really requires people in charge to be committed and to really learn. And in addition to that, at the national level, there will be a huge challenge about cross-ministerial coordination, because power sector's regulator is sitting in a different ministry, and industry sector has a separate regulator, environment ministry a separate ministry. So how all the ministries can coordinate together, plus how the trading side gonna be regulated, that's gonna share between Ministry of Environment and other market and financial sector regulators. So I think this coordination will be also a key challenge moving forward.
Thank you, Lina. Now, Guido.
Hi, Caroline. So I'm looking here at the questions in the chat. But yeah, I guess there's one regarding the bill, when it will be submitted to Congress. So we don't know that yet, because we have no political decision in Brazil. It's yet to be made. So we have no timeline regarding that. The bill is not even drafted yet. We have just the roadmap. So no, unfortunately not. What are the main barriers to the implementation of an ETS in Brazil? Well, technically, we have the necessity for an MRV system. So this is a technical barrier that we are facing right now. But as Vicky said, the major barrier is political. We need the political decision in favor of the ETS. This is the major concern right now. Do I have any other question to answer, Carol? Can you help me?
No, I think that would be all. Thank you, Guido. But yeah, anything you would like to add, or is it?
Well, there are some questions here about the role of the companies in decarbonizing the economy. Well, I guess it's all the most important for them to take a lead in that, and even to pressure the governments, which should be leading. And if your government is not leading the process, maybe the enterprises can take the lead in that and pressure the governments in order to implement these low carbon policies, and this will lead to certainly a much better outcome in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Guido. Thank you all our panelists for your time and dedication to produce these slides and share your experience with us. I'm shifting to Portuguese now. Muito obrigada a todos e todas pela presença aqui. Acho que a gente teve muita informação, né? Foram 6 painelistas, 6 mercados inteiros que a gente teve o desafio de analisar nesse encontro. Certamente não deu para falar de tudo, não deu para se aprofundar em todos os tópicos, mas acredito que foi o começo aí de um aprendizado sobre esse assunto para alguns de vocês, e para os outros talvez acrescentou em termos de conhecer o estado a história e o estado da implementação desses mercados nessas diversas jurisdições. Acho que a gente pode ver que a gente tem experiências muito diferentes e também estágios diferentes de implementação, e é muito rico a gente poder olhar para toda essa diversidade de experiências, né? E aqui, claro, isso tudo certamente contribui, inclusive, para aqueles mercados que ainda não começaram, como é o caso do Brasil, se inspirar nesses tantos modelos que estão sendo desenvolvidos aqui. Então, e aí só antes de encerrar, vou responder uma das perguntas aí no questionário que foi um pouco, talvez um pouco mais ampla, né, em termos do papel das instituições e dos governos. Acho que foi um pouco da pergunta que o Guido também tentou responder agora no final, e das empresas nesse processo todo, né, de descarbonização das economias, inclusive na capacitação, né, de todos os agentes econômicos aí nesse processo. De fato, é um processo integrado, né, de todos os stakeholders aí em cada jurisdição. Então, o governo implementando esses mercados está fazendo certamente um papel, mas também é importante que o setor privado entenda isso e participe, né, do que foi, acho que o que a Vicky muito bem comentou sobre os desafios políticos de engajamento nessa agenda, e a gente também tem os desafios de conhecimento, de educação, de as pessoas entenderem o que significa precificar carbono, o que significa ter um mercado de emissões, regular empresas que têm limitação de emissões. Então, realmente existe um desafio de capacitação muito grande, e eu espero que esse evento aqui e essa nossa série de eventos contribua para melhorar esse cenário e de compartilhamento de conhecimento e capacitação de todos. Então, com isso, me despeço aqui, em nome dos nossos organizadores, e desejando a todos e todas um ótimo dia. Um abraço.
Obrigado.
Muchas gracias.
Thanks, everybody.
Gracias. Muito obrigada.
Obrigado a todos. Tchau.